Good evening and welcome to the 7th presentation of the 2023-2024 season of Avalanche Canada's webinar series. We're so excited to be here and to continue to share some great presentations with you this season. So thanks for joining us tonight. My name's Sarah Taylor and I'm your producer for this evening. Amy Irving's our moderator, and she'll be looking out for your questions in the Q&A box. Over the last 3 years, we've presented a variety of webinars and found that being online means that we get to share our avalanche safety messaging with even more of you than before. We're so stoked you're with us this evening, and we're always appreciative of you sharing these webinars with other people who might enjoy them. Our mission is to help educate backcountry users so that they can go out and play safe. We want you all to know more, go further, and come home. First, we'd like to acknowledge that our session is being hosted in the territory of 4 nations. The Snipes, Secwepemc, Ktunaxa, and Syilx. As a national organisation, we also acknowledge the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations on whose land we live and recreate. Before we start tonight's session, we'd like to thank our sponsors. We're very grateful for our sponsors' loyal support and for their work in helping us reach backcountry users this winter. We have our government partners, our programme partners, our affiliations, and our premier sponsors, supporting sponsors, and contributors. This webinar tonight is host-sponsored by Outdoor Research. Over the past 2 years alone, Outdoor Research has donated well over $23,000 to supporting AvCan's programs and services, and as well as these generous donations, this year they also kitted out our field teams in awesome warm weather jackets, which we know they've appreciated more than ever in the past week or so. We're so grateful to Outdoor Research's dedication to public avalanche safety and for all of their contributions to keeping us doing what we do. Before we get going, a couple of housekeeping notes to share. Everyone will be automatically muted. There'll be lots of opportunities to ask questions, particularly in this webinar. To do so, click the raise hand icon that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once you've done that, we can unmute you so you can ask a question live. Another way to ask a question is in the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. Please make sure you do use that Q&A box for your questions rather than the chat box, because sometimes we won't see them in there. Stick around till the end because we've got some names to pull to win some AvCan swag. Today's presentation is Choosing Terrain for Skiers. Terrain choice is always the answer to having a safe and fun day in the backcountry. When the avalanche hazard is high, or if you're concerned about certain avalanche problems, you need to be able to recognise which terrain is safe and, more importantly, rule out the terrain that's not safe. You're in for a treat tonight because Avalanche Canada Vancouver Island lead field technician and avalanche forecaster Colin Garritty is going to lead you through a variety of images and exercises to help you hone your terrain skills. Colin's been an avalanche forecaster for 8 years and has led the Vancouver Island team since its inception 3 years ago. Colin will be presenting various scenarios, showing terrain combined with the danger rating and helping you guide you through the process to making good choices. Your questions are very welcome, but they're going to be most valuable if you ask them while we're discussing the scenario you wanted to talk about. So don't be shy about raising your hand or putting a question in that little question answer box. So without further ado, I will pass it along to Colin. Enjoy the presentation.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that great intro. Really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just give me a moment. And you should see it up now, right? I think so. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really excited to talk about choosing terrain, where the rubber meets the road. This is all about kind of, taking all of our knowledge and applying it into the steps that we take in the terrain in the backcountry so that we are positioning ourselves so that we're safe from avalanches at all times, whenever we can. So I'm going to move on to maybe just kind of now that you know a little bit about me, I want to get Sarah to launch a few polls just to learn a little bit about the folks that are joining us here tonight. So first of all, where's your local snowpack? Where are you recreating? So we've got all kinds of our forecast region kind of groups are kind of outlined here. The Interior BC covers a lot of them. So feel free to put that in there. And there might be some kind of terrain characteristics that are a little bit kind of specific to some of these places, as well as avalanche problems and kind of snowpack characteristics. Lots of Southwest BC, lots of Interior BC and the Rockies, great. And a smattering from elsewhere in the country, great. Cool, okay, I'll keep those in mind, Southwest, Interior, and Rockies. Awesome. That's really good. That's like kind of our maritime snowpack climate, our intermountain climate, and then our continental climate that we're kind of covering with that selection. Good. And I think, do I close that? I think I close it. And then we can also learn a little bit about what kind of activities you're engaging in. So whether it's snowshoeing, skiing, sledding, or actually we've got the mountain weather forecast poll. That's great too. This is a really important resource. It's kind of aside from terrain, but really kind of builds into our terrain decisions every day when we're doing our daily process, going through that weather forecast and matching it up with what we see in the field and seeing if things are lining up the way we expect them to. Really important resource. But it's okay if you haven't been exposed to it before. I'm definitely a daily user. Yeah, lots of dailies in there, day or two before heading out, once or twice a week, and year round. Yeah, that's important too, because it's like there's really good fire weather stuff that happens in the summer and smoke and things like that in years past. And so, yeah, really good resource all year round. And we've got, level of avalanche training. This is a really good one too, just to know where people are at in terms of their exposure to avalanche education. If you've maybe done like the AvSavvy tutorial on the AvCan website, or maybe you've done AST1, AST2, or maybe you're at the pro level, really cool too. Aspiring pro level. And if you're at that none level, definitely check out that AvSavvy link on, actually, I'm sure it'll end up in the chat box here. Really great place to expose yourself to some avalanche education, and lots of AST1s here, which is really good. And some folks that are maybe AST1 curious, some AST2s, and a couple pros. Cool. 5 pros. Right on. Well, welcome everybody. Have we got any other polls, or should I just move right ahead? There we are. The main winter sport. How do you get around out there? Are you a skier, snowboarder, snowmobiler, snow biker, kind of same deal, mechanized, or ice climber? Also very cool. Maybe some of those Rockies. There's been some ice climbing going on the island actually recently. Pretty cool. Nice. Lots of backcountry skiers and some snowshoers, ice climbers, and a snowmobiler. Welcome. Awesome. Great. Well, that's a good overview of kind of who we're engaging with tonight, and like a really good kind of cross section of the backcountry community of this part of the country. So really excited to kind of get into it with you guys. So I'll kind of start moving into things here. So there's kind of like a big idea that we like to talk about at Avalanche Canada, because there's, we can get that question like, should people be in the backcountry, or what's the right terrain to ride in or to recreate in to be safe in terrain or in the backcountry? And it's a tough one to answer because like the conditions around us are always kind of changing. So a line that we like to use that really kind of captures it all for us is matching terrain to conditions. So conditions are always changing, but terrain stays the same. And so as we kind of get a grasp on conditions, it helps us make decisions about what terrain's appropriate on a given day, and which terrain we should rule out on different days. So you can imagine why we like to say it. It's no matter what is going on in the weather and the snowpack, recreationists want to know what's going on in the conditions and the terrain around them. So our very best analysis and our forecast really can't even compete with the knowledge that you can have by examining in real time the conditions that you're experiencing and when you're out there, and using those kind of observations to manage your day in the mountains. So before we get into some of these scenarios, I just want to go over a bit of a refresher of the forecast kind of sections that are each one of these sections is going to kind of play into each of these scenarios. And it's just good to kind of remind ourselves what are these key sections of the forecast. So the headline's a really big one for us. It's probably where forecasters spend the bulk of their kind of creative energy when it comes to coming up with ways of communicating what they know and trying to influence behavior of backcountry recreationists. And so it's the summary of what you should be getting from the headline is the overall picture of what the day is going to be like out there. and most importantly, what you can do about it. So a way of managing the situation that's taking place in the mountains. So you can see an example like this with new snow and wind forming deep and reactive slabs. This sounds like a high avalanche. There you go. You can see on the rating there, it's actually a high avalanche day or avalanche danger day. And so the advice, what you can do about it on a day like this, is avoiding avalanche terrain entirely and overhead hazard. So you might not even need to be directly in like the start zone of an avalanche path or something like that to be avoiding avalanche terrain. You'd be thinking about runouts and tracks and things like that as well. So that headline is like really, really key piece of information. Really, if you take nothing else from the forecast, that's probably one of the most important things to take home or take out there with you. Danger ratings is really all about the overall danger at each elevation band. And it's worth, when you're going through the forecast, we can kind of come away sometimes thinking, it's red today, or it's orange, or, it's medium or moderate or whatever that middle one is. Actually knowing the definitions of these danger ratings is really helpful. So if you click on, when you're in the forecast, the little plus sign on the rating itself, it'll actually give you a definition of the rating. And so high avalanche danger is very dangerous avalanche conditions. We're expecting basically large natural avalanches to occur. And so under considerable avalanche danger, we'd be calling it dangerous avalanche conditions, where large human triggered avalanches are likely, but natural avalanches are more in that kind of possible realm. And then things kind of move down. Moderate, natural avalanches are possible. Human triggered avalanches are possible, and natural avalanches are unlikely, etc. Moving on into another section is the avalanche problems. And I really encourage folks, when they're going through the forecast, on that first page, you get the headline, you get the danger rating, you got the colors for the day, you can see some basic terrain travel advice. Really encourage folks to click on that second tab of the forecast to get a look at the problems, because without understanding kind of the structure of the snowpack, the actual physical properties of the problem that exists out there, it's harder to manage that problem. If I'm trying to manage, say, a moderate danger rating, it's tough for me to just manage that idea of moderate avalanche danger if I don't know whether it's a wind slab problem that affects wind affected areas, or whether it's a low probability, high consequence persistent slab problem that affects like maybe even below tree line areas, where maybe folks would more sooner, look to that kind of terrain as a way of escaping or kind of getting out of more obvious problematic terrain. And so understanding the problem is really helpful for helping you to kind of choose the terrain that's appropriate, or that to actually avoid it. Because in this problem description, you're getting the nature of the hazard and then where it is in the terrain. So what elevation bands is it at? Which slope aspects is it on? And the likelihood of avalanches. So the idea of like whether you would trigger one, or one might happen naturally, and whether this is like a high probability kind of event or a low probability, but maybe a high consequence type of event, which is, different avalanche problems align with those different characteristics. And then moving into our route challenges. So each of these challenges, or kind of scenarios that we'll go through this evening, first of all, they're going to require quite a bit of audience participation. So I hope the folks that have tuned in tonight are comfortable kind of jumping on the mic and chatting a little bit about their kind of their thoughts about what terrain seems appropriate given the scenario that's put in front of them. But each of additionally, each of the challenges are going to contain those danger ratings, the problems, as well as a bit of a weather history and some 3D terrain imagery. So that's kind of how we're going to be kind of analyzing the terrain, is visually through this 3D terrain imagery. And then the reason to use this 3D terrain imagery, we have a lot of, a catalog of great terrain photos of AvCan. So it seems a bit odd that we would need to maybe resort to 3D imagery, but there's actually a really good reason for this, or several good reasons. One is, modern map navigation applications like, say, FatMap or Gaia GPS or CalTopo, they're becoming very popular. So we use them all the time ourselves. I think my main navigation tools now that I'm kind of I've basically switched right over to. I use Gaia for my more trip planning type stuff, and then I'll use FatMap for more on the ground kind of micro kind of identification of features and micro navigation. And that's kind of, I'm not the only one. There's a lot of folks that have pretty much switched over to using these kinds of apps for navigation. And what else is really cool about them is you can zoom in on the actual places you're going, and the imagery is quite realistic these days, where you can see an image like this, and it's almost tough to see which is the photo and which is the 3D terrain image. So really quite realistic and kind of representative of the places that we actually go, like directly representative. And then one of the reasons that we'll delve into in quite a bit of detail tonight is that these applications, or several of them in one way or another, they allow you to overlay helpful information like aspect, elevation, incline, avalanche terrain characteristics, depending on which product you're using. Some will say things like slope angle, some will say like avalanche terrain, basically doing the same thing. And then since the forecast is created with these same parameters in mind, like incline, elevation, aspect, these features that these products are offering up really can enrich the trip planning process. So yeah, and these days it's starting to look pretty good. So it's definitely a really valuable tool for us. So we'll dig into our first scenario here, and you can see we've kind of at our console, we're kind of traveling through space and time to maybe some part of, we'll say, British Columbia, where we've got a situation with considerable danger in the alpine, moderate danger at tree line and below tree line. And the forecaster wants us to know that we need to watch for the formation of fresh wind slabs in exposed terrain as southwest wind picks up ahead of the storm on Thursday. So this is like a problem that doesn't exist now, but it's going to start to exist over the course of the day. So that's already, there's kind of like a temporal aspect that we're kind of thinking about. Conditions at the beginning of the day are going to look different from conditions at the end of the day. So that's going to affect our trip planning. Snow amounts appear modest for Thursday, but watch for hazard to increase through the day, especially in areas that receive more than 20 centimeters of new snow, which is a bit too granular for us because we're not going to actually make snow observations, but we can certainly do some trip planning with this information in mind. And it's already jumped ahead on me. Sorry. I'm trying to move this bar. There it is. Okay. So in terms of the weather history, there's been no new snow. Okay. Southwest wind is blowing already, and it's been a steady kind of -10 coolish temperatures. And then digging into tab 2 of our avalanche forecast, we can check out the problems. So for that wind slab, it exists in the alpine, or may exist in the alpine or at tree line, could exist on all aspects, which is interesting, right? Because we're talking about a southwest wind, but we've got an all aspect wind slab. So we should dig into that a little bit. And then the chances of avalanches, we're calling that likely. So by the end of the day, the forecaster's thinking by the end of the day, there's probably going to be a wind slab that you could trigger out there. Somewhere between a small, like a size 1 avalanche, but maybe in a place that's got a lot of really productive wind transport going on, fetching snow and dropping it into lee aspects, you could form a large wind slab by the end of the day, is maybe what they're thinking here. So digging into that a little bit, time and relatively cool temps are tempering the reactivity of wind slabs formed over the weekend. Okay, so we're talking about a previous wind slab problem already here. Okay, but a fresh round of wind slabs will form Thursday, this day, as the southwest wind picks up ahead of the next storm. Okay, so that starts to clarify our wind slab problem a little bit. It's all aspects because previous wind slabs may have existed on kind of south and west aspects, maybe from a north wind or something like that, but they've maybe started to stabilize. They're not as reactive as they once were. But with this building wind, we expect new, but maybe smaller wind slabs to form on north and east aspects. I mean, smaller, but growing in size over the course of the day. So we've kind of got our head around half of the problem puzzle. in understanding this wind slab. And that's probably a big part of what's feeding into a considerable rating in the alpine, right? This building problem, as well as feeding into the tree line rating. So we're thinking about tree line too. Probably like ridge crests, places where that wind transport is going to be a little bit more dramatic at tree line, where you have actual wind exposure. Problem 2, we've got a persistent slab. So this one exists at all elevation bands. Very good to know about. All aspects. It's out there. It's everywhere. So we kind of it starts to beg the question of what is this persistent slab? How come it's everywhere? And the chances of avalanches are unlikely to possible. So probably not going to trigger this avalanche, but it's possible to trigger this avalanche. It's out there. It's kind of lurking. And then the expected size of this avalanche, we're getting it size 2 to 3.5. So really quite large avalanches can be triggered here. So this one I definitely want to know some more about. So the early December crust can be found down 80 to 150 centimeters below the surface. So if you can imagine an 80 to 150 centimeter slab, it's a really big slab. And if that connects across a large piece of terrain, it's certainly, you're able to imagine like a large avalanche that could be produced by a slab that's that deep. So already starting to form a bit of a picture of what this slab looks like in the terrain. Activity, so avalanche activity on this interface has tapered off. We haven't seen new avalanches in a while. While activity has tapered off, it makes it difficult to have much confidence in stepping out into bigger terrain, as avalanches failing on this layer have the potential to be large and destructive, right? So any avalanche is going to trigger that deep. It's going to be large. It's going to be destructive unless it's, really narrow or something like that. Seems unlikely to me. So we've got this sense of what's out there. And then the reason why we're seeing it at all aspects and all elevations, I think the clue here is that it's a crust, right? So the early December crust, and a crust that forms on all aspects and all elevations sounds to me like a rain crust. So sometime in early December, we got a warm pattern, Pineapple Express type thing, atmospheric river, whatever you want to call it, and warm, wet weather, rained and formed a crust. And then that is kind of sitting in the snowpack as a possible bed surface for large avalanches. And so, the places that I might trigger this, I'm actually thinking probably the most significantly about alpine and tree line with this one as well, because with something that deep, if I'm traveling on the snow surface, it's unlikely as a skier that my stress bulb below my skis is actually really impacting, say, 150 centimeters below the surface. It takes quite a bit of pressure. Maybe a snowmobile or kind of trenching could make something like that happen. But in the alpine and at tree line, we can have really variable distribution of snow from wind. Our wind slab problem kind of speaks to this, right? It exists at higher elevation. So when you have a variable snowpack, you end up with places that are thin and places that are thick snowpack. And if you're kind of moving around on thin snowpack areas, maybe that 150 centimeter deep layer where it's, in a more uniform area would be 150 centimeters deep. In a thin spot might only be 50 centimeters deep. And now my stress bulb is actually able to touch that layer and possibly trigger it and maybe propagate a failure into a thicker part of the snowpack to release that really large avalanche. So I'm already starting to get a bit of a sense of what the physical properties are of these problems that exist out there. You've got just a snippet of the terrain so far, so I'll give you the full view. There we are. So this one almost looks photographic as well. Lots of really nuanced terrain here. There's, I would say there's some complex avalanche terrain in here, but there's actually some simple avalanche terrain in here as well. You can see all kinds of things. So there's a predominant wind direction that can probably be visible to some of you here if you're looking closely at the cornice formation around. If you're looking really close, you might want to get right in and kind of pick apart on your screen. You might see evidence of wind, so recent wind. If you look really close, right around here, you'll see some rippling of wind effect. And places like here, you can see kind of pillows of wind slab that have formed. Of course, this is an image of the actual snowpack that we're going out into. This is like a satellite image that is like enhanced and things like that, but it's not, it's still a photograph at one point or another. And from season to season, it might not look identical to this. The cornices might be smaller, might be larger, but that's where the cornices form, and that's where the wind effect takes place. And so we can still use this information, even though it's not, the actual place, the actual conditions we're going out into. There's actually a bit of a fat map freebie on this one. If anybody can see evidence of previous avalanches. And of course, these are avalanches that don't pertain to this, scenario that we're talking about. But, if you look closely here, I can see a slab that's pulled out right in here. You can see a crown fracture there. You can see the stock wall down here, the flanks of the avalanche. And then if you look down below, you can see these piles of debris down here. So you got some pretty serious avalanche terrain in here. Worth noting, right? Even though, maybe you go there today and you don't see that there was an avalanche there yesterday or something like that. The avalanches certainly can happen there. So it's starting to kind of prime me for the kind of terrain that I'm looking at. And then the elevation band that we're at. Does anybody want to pipe up and let me know what elevation band we're looking at here? Oh. Do we have a raise hand, or maybe in the chat? I'll pull up the chat. Alpine. I'm seeing some alpine. Yeah. I'd say this is definitely alpine terrain. We do have some trees around here, but the trees are really sparse and they're kind of focused at the kind of the lowest elevation of the terrain. And you can see a little bit of kind of tree liney type features around, but in general, we're definitely looking at the alpine and kind of alpine features at tree line. So that's a good answer there. And then, in this terrain, do you think you could ski or ride in simple terrain if the situation called for it? So this is terrain that would have very limited exposure to small avalanches, where you'd have options to reduce your exposure to avalanches, where you're unlikely to be traveling on glacier or having to deal with crevasse hazards, those kinds of things. And more obvious small. Yeah, and there's a good answer there. With caution, yes, there is simple terrain in this picture. So another one for you is just a question: does the presence of that simple terrain or like non-avalanche terrain, because there's some non-avalanche terrain in this image as well, where avalanches simply won't be able to run or won't be able to reach. Would this zone be a good choice under, say, high avalanche danger with like a stormy weather? And does anybody have some thoughts on whether that would be like a storm day kind of destination in a zone like this? And why or why not? That's a really good answer there from David Kerr. Yeah, great responses that are coming up here. Yeah, really good one there from Taylor too. So folks are saying that you might lose your way. So I can imagine in a place like this, in a storm, would be really tough to see where you're going. It'd be really tough to know about the overhead terrain that's around you. The drainage at the lower left looks low angle enough to be safe, but low vis would limit the ability to observe steep nearby terrain, especially that overhead terrain that was mentioned as well. And seems like you could skin through without crossing any run-out zones. It's absolutely true. You could. You might need like X-ray vision to see through the storm to make that happen. And it also, Alan has a good point that it could depend on your access through lower elevations. So access and egress is really important here. If it's a big storm, you got to the Alpine somehow. If you got here by helicopter, sure, but if you had to climb up through lower elevations, it would depend a lot on what that terrain looked like as well. Yeah, Nick had a really good experience where he actually, couldn't actually see the overhead hazards. This has happened to him before. And I've definitely been in places where, I've looked at the map after being there and like, oh, I'm not sure if I really thought too much about that slope that I couldn't see that was like not too far from where I was standing. So yeah, definitely some pretty complex terrain in places, and like at least nuanced terrain. There's a lot to read into here. So I'm going to outline a bunch of zones here. We've got this kind of purple one on the right-hand side, this long, skinny blue one, and this kind of maroon, long, skinny maroon one, and this big, broad pink one, peachy pink kind of thing. And then we've got this green, kind of darker or teal one on the left, and then this far left one in a lighter green. Now, just thinking back to, I'll go back to our scenario, just so you can kind of recall these characteristics of the conditions that we're expecting to encounter here. Just remember those. And going back into these zones, I want you to think of 2 zones that you think would be good decisions, good places to go ski under these kinds of conditions. And think of some reasons why you'd go to those places. And think of 2 places you just don't really like. It's not really the terrain choice for the day. And we don't have to talk about them just yet, but just kind of take a good look at those. Think of some reasons why you like the terrain, and certain and then choose the ones that you don't like, and reasons why you wouldn't choose that zone on this day, on this given day. And I'm seeing some light green and maroon for go zones. Yeah, so maroon and light green, reasonable. Yeah, okay. Light green and burgundy go. Purple and pink are a heck no. Cool. Great. So we've already got some ideas coming, but you don't have to throw all your answers at me just yet. I'm actually going to start using some of these features now that are available in the software. This is actually, I want to say this is FatMap, and I've overlaid a few different characteristics here. So we can see flat terrain. This is 0 angle. These are flat places. Now, although in none of these places in green will you be able to produce an avalanche in that terrain, there are places in this green terrain that are threatened by overhead hazard, where avalanche certainly can reach those green patches of terrain. But it's just good to kind of start to calibrate. If you were thinking that there's some slope in here, this is actually basically flat meadow, essentially, in here, as well as in here. It's almost completely flat. You've got a bit of undulation, but not much going on there. So just start to kind of get a little bit of the idea of the shape of things. Tells us a little bit, not a lot to start with. Aspect starts to tell us a lot here. So those that kind of like more medium blue, like this color this thing keeps switching on me. So kind of this color here, we've got north aspect. So that kind of straightforward blue. I don't know what I'd call it, cobalt blue. And then the lighter kind of powder blue would be more like northeast aspects. And then over here, we can actually see some kind of west aspects, west and south aspects. So the orange and darker kind of maroon are quite solar. They get a lot of sun, these aspects. And these blue ones are quite shaded most of the time, I would think, being north aspects, northwest, northeast aspects. So with this in mind, a few questions. So with all these shady slopes around, it is, you think it might be a little bit worthwhile to dig into a bit of like, what is the grain type? What is the problem grain that exists that brought about our persistent slab problem? Is it facets? Is it surface hoar? And how might these present here? So if I was thinking of like, say and this is not this scenario, but if I was thinking about a surface hoar problem forms on generally shady slope. It can form on any slope, but it tends to survive. Surface hoar will survive much more easily in a shaded place than it will a sunny place. And surface hoar will also survive a little bit better in a sheltered place than a very windy place. And so you can kind of imagine that there might be some kind of shaded, sheltered places in here that could harbor that kind of problem, if that was the kind of thing that we're thinking about. But when we're thinking about a crust, and likely there's some faceted snow associated with the crust, it's very common for facets to kind of grow up immediately above and immediately below crusts. So weak snow forming around crust is very, very common. A crust facet combo, that kind of combo, that can pretty much form everywhere, right? Because it's cold temperature that makes facets happen. It's not just it'll preserve a little bit more easily than surface hoar will. Wind doesn't destroy facets. Facets will persist through wind. Surface hoar will get blown down, that kind of thing. Yeah, so just thinking a little bit about that grain type in our persistent slab is a good thing to do. Now, when we think of that incoming southwest wind, can you imagine where the first wind slab problems might form? What color slopes where will those first wind slabs start to form on? The new wind slabs that we're talking about in this forecast. Now, maybe I'll watch the chat, but anybody can feel free to kind of raise their hand or start speaking as well. Light blue. Yeah, for sure. Northeast slopes is what we're looking at. Megan, nice one. Megan is sharp. Nice. Yeah. Razor sharp. Cool. So we can look at our zone choices again. And so how do your decisions, how did your terrain choices stack up with regard to the formation of new wind slabs? Wind direction is where it's coming from. Yeah, so wind direction is southwest, so that means it's blowing snow from southwest slopes onto northeast slopes. You bet, David. Yeah, so anybody who was thinking of this kind of purple zone, I heard somebody saying it was a no-go zone. That's a pretty reasonable approach. It's quite steep terrain. I mean, we'll get into slope angle in a minute, but this is kind of where I would expect some of the first wind slab to form on northeast slopes, and then we can kind of see a little bit of northeast in here, some in here. This ridge crest. Oh, I'm pointing on the wrong screen. Here we go. Yeah, this purple zone. So wind slabs forming in here, right along these ridge crests, especially this northeast facing ridge crest. This would be a perfect place for new wind slab to form, right along that crest. And we can see more of that along here as well. Depending on the slope angle here, it could be problematic, but if it's lower angle terrain, it might not be so problematic. That wind slab is forming on, say, 20-degree terrain. It's less likely to produce an avalanche at that low of a slope angle. And then when we look at these kind of southwest slopes over here, that's where the wind's getting stripped away from. So this ends up being a pretty, benign terrain with respect to wind slab hazard, because what's happening here is the wind's being stripped off this slope and getting deposited over on this slope over here. So yeah, thinking about how those decisions stacked up when we apply aspect to the picture. Next up, we've got slope angle. So this is really interesting. We've got 25 to 30-degree terrain is this kind of light yellow shade. It really almost borders almost every one of these patches of steeper terrain. There's some kind of less steep terrain that's worth noting. A lot of and then below 25 degrees, we actually have, it doesn't get a shading, right? So there's actually a ton of terrain that's sub 25 degrees. If we look at this zone here, pretty much all of that's under 25 degrees. You'd be hard pressed to be able to produce an avalanche in this kind of terrain under anything but the most touchy kind of conditions. That said, it's flanked by pretty serious avalanche. Oh, I don't know if I'm pointing at the wrong screen again here. So I was actually pointing at this guy here. Lot of sub 25-degree terrain here. But yeah, flanked by very serious avalanche terrain in here where we were talking about new wind slabs forming, and some moderately serious avalanche terrain in here where we're kind of getting into 30, 35-degree terrain. It's a little bit more serious, and there's little pockets of 35 to 40. Once we're getting into 40-degree terrain, that's very much, it's real avalanche terrain. If you've got an avalanche problem that you're kind of tiptoeing around, that 40-degree terrain is the kind of slope angle that it will take to produce the avalanche. Now, I got a question here from Bridie Lemke saying, with the wind in the green zone causing it to be thinner snowpack in that section, would it have a higher risk to propagate to the higher risk section? So I think we're talking about the wind affecting this southwest slope. You will end up with a little bit of a shallower snowpack here. And that's actually super relevant. I would say a shallow place would be a place you'd be more likely to trigger one of those deep instabilities down to the crust, right? So if I was going to try to recreate here, for sure, I'm going to be probably safe from a wind slab, but I want to bear in mind that persistent slab problem. And what might save me in this terrain is that it's quite low angle. So there's probably a nice low angle line that can be taken through here that's unlikely to give that big climax, low probability, high consequence avalanche. But that's a really, really good point that Brady's brought up there. Cool. And I think that's the actually, before we move on from this scenario, does anybody have other questions about or anything to mention about this this zone here? Sarah.
We actually have a question. It's not about this zone.
Okay.
It's about something that you said a little earlier. We have a question about what the scope and depth of that stress bulb looks like.
We'll have to come up with like a link that talks about the stress bulb. I think we've got something in the glossary that talks about stress bulb. There's papers that talk about the stress bulb. It's essentially like an area of pressure. If you can imagine, almost like a bubble that kind of emanates down from your position on the snow, and the stress is greatest at where you're standing or where you're located, and the stress decreases with depth, and it kind of forms like almost like a U shape essentially in the snow below you. And anywhere that's kind of contained within that stress bulb is it's able to perturb an avalanche a weak layer. So you're able to actually like touch a weak layer or potentially trigger an avalanche on that weak layer. Somebody's saying, Dave's saying like a shock wave. Yeah, it's not too far off for sure. Basically your pressure, the weight of your body or your machine pushing down into the snow and influencing the grains below you. It's essentially pressure.
Awesome. Thank you.
Too bad the funnest terrain is usually the most dangerous. Yeah, and that's totally like we can kind of go back all the way to slide 1 there with matching terrain to conditions. There's never a day I'll never say to someone that, you know, this purple zone here that we talked about is just like off limits place that I would never ski. But I would certainly be looking for the friendliest possible avalanche conditions to be playing in that kind of terrain. People ski 40, 50 degree terrain all the time. But it's all about matching the terrain with the conditions. It's not the kind of stuff that I would be trying to ski generally midwinter when we've got more persistent layers that are kind of active, more new snow problems that are kind of going on. We haven't really like arrived at like a fully settled snowpack where I'm just thinking about like the surface conditions. But we do get to that place at some point, usually in the spring, we'll kind of see things start to consolidate. We're just, and unless we've got like a deep persistent slab problem that's potentially going to go off on a certain kind of under certain conditions, usually a warming event or something like that, then that's the time to start to kind of think about tackling those bigger objectives. But usually midwinter is the time to kind of back away from those until you've got some really friendly avalanche conditions. Taylor's asking, how would you mitigate the persistent slab problem in these example zones? Lower angle terrain like the marine zone, ignoring the rest of the issues. You're bang on there. Really, when it comes to managing persistent slabs, the way to do it is through disciplined terrain selection. And what that discipline looks like is choosing lower angle terrain. Lower angle terrain is less capable of producing large avalanches in general, and large avalanches certainly. And then I've got the questions are coming hard and fast here. So let me take a look. Considering it's everywhere in alpine and treeline. Yeah, that's right. It's everywhere. Yeah. So lower angle terrain is the strategy. Folks who are choosing like this blue zone and this maroon zone were right on the money in terms of choosing like low angle terrain that's unlikely to produce avalanches. And then you've got little pieces of avalanche terrain, like kind of in there, like in this blue strip, we've got like an avalanche slope in here. And this would be a place, you know, if you made this terrain decision, you'd want to be, you know, managing this piece of terrain. Maybe you've included it in what you're going to ski on this day. You've committed yourself to this piece of terrain. Come up with a plan for how you're going to tackle it with your group. You know, are you going to ski it one at a time while each person watches? Are you going to look for the lowest angle piece of terrain? Are you going to choose a small representative slope nearby that you can throw a ski cut into to see if the wind slabs that have maybe started to form are starting to produce any kind of cracking or that kind of thing. So, making specific decisions to try to manage the conditions, manage the terrain, even if you're going to include some avalanche terrain or some more serious avalanche terrain in your line, coming up with a plan for how you and your group are going to tackle it as safely as possible, exposing as few people as possible to it at once. Sarah.
We have a couple more questions in the Q&A box.
Okay.
The first one is about remote triggers and how we can predict if we're in a lightly remote trigger location.
Right. I would say, this is kind of when we're getting into like higher probability avalanche problems are more likely to be remote triggered. And so of the avalanche problems that we're looking at in this scenario, I would say that the fresh wind slab is going to be the problem that is the most likely to be remote triggered. So it's really, it's talking about the sensitivity of the avalanche problem. So a natural avalanche occurs with, it's very sensitive. It doesn't even need like a mechanical trigger to trigger it. It's just or an artificial trigger. It can just run naturally because of the amount of snow that's loaded or different characteristics that have allowed that avalanche to run. And then, a step back from that natural avalanche is more a remote trigger, something that's sensitive, but still needs some kind of perturbation in order to actually trigger. And so that would be the remote trigger. And so I would be thinking in terms of remote triggers, the most sensitive avalanche problem is the one that's most likely to be remote triggerable.
All right. And then we also have a question about supported and unsupported slopes and what the importance of those is in this scenario.
Yeah. So supported slopes is a really important concept, and it's a very commonly misunderstood concept. So slope support is literally, it's tough to visualize here, but if I kind of like, maybe I'll just hold my hand up. So if I have a slope like this, that's kind of moving downhill, and it just kind of like does like this thing where it kind of gently, the bottom of the slope is supporting the snowpack on the upper slope, right? So that's a supported slope. But if I have a slope that does this, where it kind of like breaks off and there's nothing kind of supporting this slope here, and then a slab could actually just slide off there because nothing's actually holding it in place, that's an unsupported slope. It's much more likely to produce avalanches than a supported slope. An unsupported slope, kind of probably the most classic example of an unsupported slope would be like a cliff. A slope that ends in a cliff is unsupported. So variations on slopes that end abruptly, those are some variation on less supported slopes, and slopes that end gently are more supported slopes.
Thank you.
Yeah. And if you're going to trigger an avalanche on one of those two, whether it's a unsupported slope is more likely to produce avalanches than a supported slope. Supported slopes are stronger. They hold the snowpack in place much better than unsupported slopes. The blue and maroon zones look very similar in terms of aspect, slope angle, etc. And maroon actually looks to have a little bit more historic wind effect. Good observation there. Is it the overhead hazard above the blue that pushes it into more dangerous territory? There isn't much in the way of overhead hazard in the blue zone unless you're standing in this location here. Unless you're standing in this location down here. Once you're down here, you've got this slope overhead. In here, you don't really have much in the way of overhead hazard. In a place like this, you are totally, flanked or covered by overhead hazard in this spot here. A place like this, you've got overhead hazard right above you in these kinds of places. This is like, these are some of the more obvious overhead hazard spots. And so, yeah, that's definitely not to say supported slopes aren't capable of producing avalanches. They absolutely can. It's actually we mostly see avalanches on supported slopes because supported slopes are just more common. We see most slopes have some form of support. Not everything ends in a cliff. So I hope I answered Connor's question. Feel free to kind of rephrase if there's something that I missed about what you're saying there, but there's There's places of overhead hazard in this blue section, but by and large, it's this spot, and there's not really all that much going on there. You're kind of in avalanche terrain here rather than in, affected by overhead hazard. Yeah. Nice. Thanks, Connor. Cool. Let's move into another scenario. So scenario 2 here, we've got new snow and wind forming deep and reactive slabs. Okay, it's on. Potential exists for storm slab avalanches to step down to deeply buried weak layers, resulting in very large avalanches. Damn. So we want to avoid avalanche terrain and overhead hazard. Okay, so this is like, we've got a storm day here. We've got 40 centimeters of new snow. It's snowing. We'll say it's snowing hard. Strong southwest wind. This is like a classic British Columbia Pacific storm, a snow producer, snowpack builder. Great. So let's dig into the storm slab a little bit and kind of make sure that we understand what's going on. It's all aspects, all elevations, and this is characteristic of storm slabs. This is an avalanche problem that affects all elevations and all aspects because snow is falling and accumulating on all of them. It's at all elevations and it's happening on all aspects. And so there's no particular slope, no particular elevation band or aspect that is kind of really like takes the cake in terms of like the most important slope to be concerned with. So it's happening everywhere because snowfall is happening everywhere. The chances of avalanches is very likely. So this is pretty classic for a storm. We're going to get some direct avalanche or direct action avalanche activity. So new snow, wind, it's happening. We're going to see avalanches. Probably, if we can see on this day, we're probably going to see some avalanches, or we might hear avalanches happening. Anywhere from like a small, like a 1.5 all the way to maybe a 2.5, or is that a 3? So size 3 avalanche is big. It checks out 40 centimeters of new snow with some wind loading on a northeast aspect. That could produce a size 3 avalanche, no problem, right? So digging into the storm slab, snowfall is expected to continue until Friday night, bringing up to 40 centimeters plus of low density storm snow. This will add to the amount the region received in the last weekend during the previous storm, 20 to 60 centimeters. So we've got kind of probably a quite reactive 40 centimeters, but there's some uncertainty about whether the last 20 to 60 centimeters below that. So now we're talking about up to 100 centimeters. Maybe there's a failure plane from the previous storm that's still kind of in play. It hasn't quite healed up yet. So we're thinking of storm slabs that could be anywhere from 40 centimeters deep to a meter deep. So really significant. That can produce certain, now the size 3 is definitely starting to make sense, right? So reactive storm slab avalanches are expected at all elevations, including loose, dry avalanches in sheltered areas. This is really key. So just because we've got a storm slab problem out there doesn't mean it's going to present as, we're the only snow characteristic we're going to observe is a storm slab. If the slab hasn't formed yet, if that snow hasn't quite consolidated, it's going to run loose instead of fracturing out as a slab. And so we need to be thinking about that too. So that's part of our observations and part of our terrain selection, thinking about how loose snow might slough quite dramatically when there's that much new or fresh snow around. And then wind slabs in lee terrain at mountaintops. Classic, right? So where the wind is moving snow around or is kind of preferentially loading certain slopes, conditions are going to be a little bit heightened there. So although this is in all aspects, all elevations kind of problem, I'm probably thinking because of this strong southwest wind, again, northeast aspects are particularly suspect. And again, the alpine is probably particularly affected by this problem because we're going to see the greatest wind, the greatest redistribution of snow onto adjacent slopes because it can happen. You've got ridge crests where snow can move from one aspect to another. Okay, starting to get a handle on our storm slab. In terms of our persistent slab, the early December crust can be found down 90 to 150 centimeters. So again, it's that same early December crust that we're dealing with, down deep. Really, it's not even all that much deeper than our storm slab, but it's under there. It's tapered off. The current storm is going to increase the load on this layer. So We've gone from this problem being like unlikely to possible. I don't think we're going to see avalanches on this layer to like now with this much loading, maybe we are going to see avalanches on this layer. So probably going to start stepping back from terrain that's going to be affected by very large avalanches. So this is already starting to prime me for the kind of terrain I'm going to look at here. So here's our zone. We can see the north wind moves that way, or sorry, southwest. North is in this direction. Southwest wind would kind of be blowing from the top left side over to the kind of bottom right side, if that makes any sense for how snow will be loading according to the wind. But all aspects and all elevations are affected by this. So just kind of get a sense of this terrain. We've got some below tree line terrain. We've got some tree line terrain. And we've got some alpine terrain. We've got cut blocks. We've got roads. We've got avalanche paths that I can see. There's lots to look at in this image. Here are a few zones to look at, and I'm going to throw some questions out at you guys. So, what part of terrain selection keeps us safe from storm slabs on a day like this? What part of the terrain selection? What's probably the most important component of terrain that's going to help us stay safe in terms of our decisions? Slope angle, slope angle, slope angle, slope angle. Love it. Yes, slope angle is the answer. Absolutely. Slope angle, because we've got all aspects, all of the elevations. Maybe all it takes with a problem like this that's kind of all over the place is just for the slope to be steep enough, and then we can get avalanches happening. There are some really nice ones here. So trees is a really important one. So vegetation, I would almost put that like kind of right up there with slope angle, because in really thick vegetation where like the canopy is touching, you're in the forest, it's much less likely for avalanches to form in that kind of terrain. Canopy has to be quite close. It's almost like uncomfortable tree skiing that we're talking about, where that's going to keep you safe in terms of vegetation. But yeah, slope angle is probably number one answer. I think the forested terrain or that thick canopy kind of terrain, I think is a really solid kind of right up there with it. It's a little bit different. It's not quite the terrain characteristics we've been talking about so far. Vegetation is really key though. Great. And low angle elevation. Elevation is reasonable, but I think avalanches are going to be happening possibly at all elevations on a day like that today, but certainly the highest elevations are going to be the most problematic. Where do you think the problem will be most severe? And I think Nick kind of nails this, is elevation, right? So if you're in the Alpine, you're going to be encountering that more severe storm slab problem, but it almost might present more as a wind slab because of that preferential loading of wind, of snowfall onto certain slopes. And then where are you expecting, because we're kind of expecting to see avalanches today, right? They're very likely. So where in the terrain are you expecting to see these natural avalanches occurring today? What comes to mind? Yeah, and Nick also kind of bolsters that elevation. It pertains to sticking in the trees. So elevation definitely ties in with below tree line, right? And alpine and above tree line. And then the south runs in the blue zones. Yeah, totally. I would say, so like this at the south of the picture in the blue zones. And I think you're really nailing it there, because you're probably looking at these avalanche paths in here. So these avalanche paths are where I kind of pretty much expect to see some kind of activity today. But then I kind of think about all this terrain as being quite problematic on a day like today. Like a storm day, I don't think I would play anywhere near a bowl like this. That said, there's maybe a safe line to be had somewhere around here. There's probably a way you could pick this apart. It's probably pretty tricky on a storm day like this though. And it's snowing, you're not going to see it. Yeah, that's right, David. Yep. Okay. And so just to kind of give us a sense of the shape of the terrain here, there's our flat zones. Again, here's our aspects, right? Again, so we've got lots of that kind of southeast and east terrain. We're kind of looking west in this image, right? And the kind of whole thing is facing the east. And so we've got each of these drainages has a north and a south aspect, essentially. But how does aspect figure into our assessments? We've already kind of ruled out aspect as like the most significant part of our assessment. It's really about an all aspect thing, but we're thinking we can still include aspect to the extent that, if there's wind transport going on, it's almost certainly going to be preferentially loading those northeast slopes. So aspect, interesting, but maybe not critical to our decision making on a day like today. And overlay those same places. And then our slope angle. So there's some non-avalanche terrain in here, right? Some quite flat stuff like these in the forest. Folks have been kind of pointing out the forest. It might be tough to move in the forest on a day like this because it's going to be deep. But you'd probably be safe from avalanches in these kind of thicker forested areas. And then something's interesting here when we see this is most certainly avalanche terrain. It's the kind of stuff that we're expecting to be preferentially loaded along the top of these things, right? And they run down, and then some of the runouts actually kind of poke out below what's been identified as not as avalanche terrain, but as steep terrain. So just because it's not steep, it doesn't mean that an avalanche can't reach you in that location. So runout zones are definitely places I would be hiding from on a day like this today when I'm expecting large avalanches and maybe thinking about the possibility for deeper persistent slab avalanches to occur. Yeah, and then certain other persistent slab problems in a place like this, I'd be thinking about like surface hoar loves to grow in openings below the trees. So these kind of, if there's a steeper cut block or like openings, like in places like this down here, this is a place I'd be thinking about surface hoar and persistent slab avalanches kind of always. I'd have to be, it's like guilty until proven innocent that there's not surface hoar hiding in this cut block down at that elevation. Here, if you're noticed in different areas, this is actually an image from the Revelstoke area. You get the bathtub ring of from the cloud layers that form surface hoar along that ring. And that's like kind of right at the upper tree line or upper below tree line area that's very often implicated in that surface hoar formation. But that's not a problem for today, or no, at least not theoretically. So I think we can kind of move on from this one, but we've got some pretty good ideas about kind of how to manage this. And then will southwest slopes be better? Yeah, I would say southwest slopes are less likely to be forming new slabs, but forming like thicker wind slabs. But, if you get into exposure and like wind exposure and wind is impacting those southwest slopes, you can get just enough wind redistribution that often it gets called wind press. I'm not sure if that's a super technical way of thinking about things, but it's almost like the wind is stiffening things just by kind of touching those slopes and moving snow along them. And it might not be preferentially loading those slopes, but just the presence of wind on those slopes tends to increase the slab properties regardless. And it is a storm day. So generally I'd be thinking about elevation, getting out of the wind and choosing some low angle terrain in the trees where I'm free of overhead hazard. And there's quite a few kind of zones that would actually work in here. And so, maybe I wouldn't ski down here or down here, but there's a line here along this ridge that's actually pretty friendly, isn't it? I mean, you'd really want to know where you're going. Maybe you've got your navigation device out to make sure that you're not dropping into this aspect, or you've got a mountain in the distance that you're looking at, if you can see anything at all, to ensure that you're still looking at that mountain and not veering down into the wrong aspect accidentally. But there are pieces of terrain that could be used in here. There's another kind of rib that could be used along here that would probably offer some pretty good skiing. And then up in here, it starts to get a little bit too complex. Or sorry, I'm pointing in the wrong place again. So I was pointing at this rib here and then this rib here being like quite friendly pieces of terrain, as long as we're not dealing with like surface hoar in the openings down there. But then as we get into this kind of tree line terrain, it's quite complicated. You're more exposed to wind. You might not be able to see as much. And there's just kind of pockets of steep terrain all over the place in here. Oh, you can still see my mouse on the wrong screen. That's great. That means I don't have to look over here. I can look right here. I appreciate that. Great. Okay. Moving right along into our next scenario, I think. And maybe I think we're getting a little bit low on time. We're kind of at time, but I'm going to squeeze one more in here, and it's this one. So it's basically the same conditions. So stormy day, we got 30 centimeters instead of 40. It's stormy, strong southwest winds, -10, storm slabs. No concern for a persistent slab, thank goodness. It makes things much easier to plan or to kind of work with when we don't have that kind of like overarching, problem that's kind of affecting so much terrain. But we are expecting a natural avalanche cycle on this day. So things are going to be running. All that low density snow we've been enjoying is now available for entrainment. Entrainment happens when maybe a small avalanche occurs, and as it runs, it picks up low density snow as it moves, and the avalanche gets larger, and it's able to run far, it's able to run fast, picking up mass and becoming more and more destructive as it moves. So those are the kinds of things we're thinking about in this terrain. And I just wanted to kind of go through this one we can first take a look at the terrain. Again, pretty complicated piece of terrain. It's not so different from what we looked at before, but it's maybe a little bit more committing. There's just generally steeper terrain everywhere. There's quite a bit of like alpine or steep features below tree line. So there's like really serious features, and they're kind of below tree line, but it's like a little bit more than what we were looking at in that last image where we just had like some cut blocks that were quite low angle. 3 different kind of elevation bands. We've got our alpine, tree line, BTL below tree line that we're looking at. Our north is this way. So our southwest wind is coming from over here. And then as we move forward, we've got our flat terrain, no big deal. Aspect, again, not super critical in this one because we're not really thinking about wind redistribution. We're not thinking about a surface ore problem that's specific to shady slopes. But we will still be thinking about that preferential loading from southwest wind because that's probably going to still be happening at higher elevations. The main thing I want to show on this one as we kind of go through these, because again, aspect isn't super critical in this one, is just this avalanche or say this slope angle. It's really good at highlighting pieces of like serious avalanche terrain, like in the alpine and places like this, but there's places that it misses, right? If we look down here, this is the run out to like size 3 avalanche terrain, right? Big avalanches can run down here, and nothing, this probably showed up in our flat terrain as like a safe place to be. It's flat. What could I possibly worried about? You need to be thinking about these overhead pieces. There's cornices up here. This is very much threatened by the terrain above it. And then if we move a little bit farther or look around a little bit more, we can see some avalanche terrain identified here in the bottom left. But what's missed by this kind of overlay is these runout zones. We got runout zones that extend well beyond where the steep terrain lies. And we're expecting avalanches right in the headline to run far and run fast. So I'd be expecting avalanches to reach the ends of runouts. So even though they're not highlighted by an image like this, in imagery in your kind of overlay, it doesn't mean it's not avalanche terrain. You're definitely affected by, or have the potential to be affected by avalanches in these kinds of places. And then what do folks think about, like, do you see there may be some safe lines in here on a day like today, right? If you could get teleported maybe to a place like this, maybe you could tie something together here that stayed below tree line, that avoided the kind of steeper terrain and kind of threaded the needle through it. Maybe in the top right, somebody's looking at this ridge line here. Sure, you might even be able to observe some wind slab formation along the ridge, give you a bit of a sense of what kind of the depth and reactivity of new snow as it's being loaded might work out. The catch is here, somebody mentioned it in an earlier question, that access egress question, like what did it take to get here? What's it going to take to get out of here? And what kind of terrain do you need to move through in order to do either one of those? And just the overall, like when we look at overall, the density of kind of serious avalanche terrain in a place like this makes it, I wouldn't say an inappropriate place on the whole to be in, because there's safe places that there's safe locations you could be in this terrain on a day like this, but it's not really straightforward to make like safe lines that fill a whole day without crossing really serious avalanche terrain or exposing yourself to serious hazards during these kinds of conditions. So with that few of options, it doesn't mean it's off the table. It just means like you're going to require like really advanced kind of picking apart the terrain, kind of track setting, route finding skills to manage a piece of terrain like this on a day like this. Cool. I think that's where I'm going to leave it for now. And then we'll leave scenario 4 out of this. It's a simple one anyway. It's like wind slab, persistent slab. We already did one of those. Yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and do, maybe I'll just bump back to one of my earlier slides and open it up to questions. So we've talked about a lot of things. I've kind of just put a whole lot out there for you guys. Is there anything that I can clarify or any questions that you have about choosing terrain and matching terrain to conditions? I'm keeping an eye on the chat here. I'm looking, maybe I'll pull up the Q&A box as well, if I can. If I can find it, there it is. No open questions. We got some answered questions. Oh, Steve had a good question here. Can you speak to what is meant by specific versus isolated areas? It generally refers to like the distribution of an avalanche problem in the terrain. So when we talk, and it's kind of, we rate them kind of, there's 3 levels of distribution that we talk about. So a widespread avalanche problem, when we talk about, say, if the problem exists, if it's, say it's a wind slab that affects northeast aspects, and it's widespread, you would expect to find that wind slab all over the place on northeast aspects. It wouldn't mean that you're going to find wind slabs on all aspects and elevations because it's widespread. It's all aspects, or within the kind of the terrain that's affected by the problem. So we're saying northeast aspects, say alpine and tree line. Within that terrain that's been identified, we're expecting it to be widespread. Specific would be talking about more particularly like steeper features, features that are more affected by wind loading, features that are less supported. That's when we're kind of getting into more specific terrain. Isolated features is more kind of extreme. So like very steep, very unsupported, kind of more extreme terrain is where we'd expect to see that problem within that terrain that's been identified. And that's a tricky one. That actually affects, or that trips up professionals sometimes when we talk about widespread problems. Widespread doesn't mean it's everywhere. It's everywhere within the terrain that we've kind of allocated or identified as where the problem exists. Remote triggers, supported, unsupported. Ooh, how significant is the difference between conifers, evergreen forest, and alder in terms of effect on the snowpack? So deciduous forest and coniferous forest affect snowpack very differently. So if anybody's ever kind of dreamt or maybe gone powder skiing in Japan, or here in Canada, if you've ever gone skiing in like a burn, like an area that's been burned before, it's not too different from what you might find in like deciduous forest or like beech forest in Japan. Places like that, that kind of forest is way more affected by wind. Surface hoar can grow in that kind of even below tree line in places like that. You'll see less kind of tree bombs and things like that disrupting the snow surface and kind of compacting things and breaking up weak layers. And so a coniferous forest generally, like when we're talking forest, like connective canopy, is much more of a mitigating, much better at mitigating exposure to avalanche hazards than deciduous forest or more open trees. Essentially, it's down to the openness of the trees. Is the area open to wind? Is it open to sun? Is it open to like open sky so that surface hoar can form on the surface? These are the kinds of things that make that terrain more problematic.
Hi, Colin. We've got a couple more questions in the chat box. to have a look
Yeah,
at.
I'm just looking at them now. Yeah.
Amazing.
So, there's a bunch here. Okay. Grace Harris, thanks. How often do you dig pits to assess terrain? I think it's important to have a question that you want to answer in order to dig your profile. So go out there with questions based on the forecast that you've read and the uncertainties that you have. And as you're moving through terrain, make observations. And when you get to a point where there's something missing about there's a knowledge gap, like I know that surface horror exists at tree line in openings, but I don't know if surface horror exists in this opening that I'm thinking about skiing. And I'm ready to just back off. And like, I'm already like on the fence about this kind of slope. That's a reasonable time to dig, to have a look, see if the surface horror exists there. So I think it's good to have questions that you want answered with your pit rather than digging a pit just to kind of check out the snow. That's like kind of a loose answer to that question. Speaks about risk associated with lower angle but undulating terrain, rolling in and out of 30 degrees. I think maybe one of the things to think about that would be like terrain traps if in undulating terrain. So when we're talking about small slopes or short slopes, they might not be able to produce large avalanches, but if there's kind of like lots of gullies in between those slopes, this person might be recreating on the North Shore, perhaps Mount Seymour. This is classic terrain where you've got like short slopes that can't produce large avalanches, but really deep, like incised gullies between these slopes that can, if an avalanche is triggered, can bury people quite deeply, really, really easily. So that's maybe the risk to think about there with that undulating terrain. Just think about terrain traps. The size of the slope is one thing, but the terrain that it's going to push, that an avalanche might push you into or bury you in, is kind of the other side of that. Quick in the field checklist to evaluate terrain. Slope angle is like so important. Make sure you have a really good understanding of slope angle. And think about vegetation. That connective canopy is like those are probably the two really important things that I would use to like mitigate my exposure to danger. Is maybe I might add overhead. So overhead's a bit of it's outside of like the terrain you're in, so it's kind of outside your question. But overhead aside, I'd be thinking about lowering slope angle or in order to mitigate danger, or moving into more forested terrain to mitigate danger. Those are like the two biggest things that I would think about. And an acronym or a few, that's tough. We should come up with one. We don't have an acronym for a terrain evaluation, but the evaluator is a pretty good like way of dealing with that. That's like kind of the closest that we have, but it's kind of talking about more than just terrain. Slope angle is like the number one though. Think about slope angle. And then daily procedures to assess conditions in the terrain and when you're in the field. Ooh, that's a big one. So I saw somebody asking about incline. Get yourself a clinometer, like the instrument, like it's got a ball bearing, like a BCA makes one. They're a partner. Really, we love BCA. That's something you can use, or most phone apps, or most phones smartphones can, like whether it's Apple or Android, there are clinometer apps that you can get, and you can kind of hold up your phone against terrain. You can lay your probe against the snow to really measure a slope. But sometimes you want to think a little bit about averages, but you also want to look at the steepest part of the slope. Focus on the steepest part of the slope, because that's the part that's the most likely to produce the avalanche. Caught Seymour gang, so funny. Okay. Daily procedures to assess conditions in terrain. It's like there's so many things that are going in through my head at kind of all times as I'm moving through terrain. So I'm thinking about what I expected in terms of the weather and what I'm seeing in terms of the weather. I'm looking for snow that's moving. I'm looking for reactivity, so shooting cracks, that kind of thing. I'm testing slopes, small slopes that I can kind of push things around and see if I can get small releases to happen that give me clues about bigger things that might be possible. And then if I see like small things are possible on small slopes and I'm kind of like at tree line, I want to really be thinking about what's above me in the Alp, like what's going, like if I see like small wind slabs forming at tree line, I know that in the Alpine, like things are getting very dangerous up there because there's more snow to move around. It's moving around more. The winds pushing it around more easily to lee slopes. And so being able to extrapolate from where you are to overhead terrain, even with the terrain that you're not affected by directly in a given moment, you know, those conditions still are a part of your day that you need to manage. And yeah, I'm not sure if that's a very clean answer to that question, but it's a big one. That's like a whole AST2 in that question. Yeah. So evaluating slope angle, I talked about that one, and want to confirm and confirm remember what you expect during planning. I think it's good. I'm not sure I fully understand the second part of the question, but it's good to, when you're going to measure slope angle, guess first. Try to know the slope angle, then measure the slope angle. Find out whether you're calibrating yourself kind of steep or shallow, and take it from there. And like studying min reports, please submit these reports to my fellow. Yes, more mins. Slope angle inclinometer app for all cell phones. Yep. Mins are invaluable. BCA makes a slope angle tool for $30 available at MEC. Alp Truth. Yeah, the acronym for daily terrain evaluation. Yep. This is a great one. It's from the US. Yep. I want to say I saw a talk about Alp Truth and I completely spaced on it. So I really appreciate that link showing up there. And I think that's all of our questions. I think. Yeah, we covered them. Cool. Okay, thanks, guys. That was like a lot in a little bit of time and tons of engagement. So I really appreciate all the voices piping up and all the super active chats. It's been really valuable, and I hope you guys get out there, have a great, safe rest of your winter, and get some extra educational opportunities out there, and keep checking out these webinars. Sarah, take it over.
Thanks, Colin. Super helpful. And there was so much good stuff in there. So many good reminders about what we're looking for and how we need to be evaluating it, and careful travel. It was great. Thank you so much.
You bet.
We also have a complimentary webinar to this coming up pretty soon. On February 21st, our webinar looks in more detail at avalanche problems. So you'll be able to link what you learn in that webinar with what you learn in this webinar, and it will really help strengthen your decision-making skills when you get out there. These webinars are a great starting point, but obviously this is not the same as getting a proper avalanche education. Avalanche training is a lifelong journey, and although this is a really helpful start, we definitely recommend that you take some courses. If you haven't taken anything yet, an AST1 is going to be the place for you to start. If you already have your AST1, but you're looking at spending some more time in the backcountry, an AST might be for you. An AST2 might be for you. There are also great options for training that aren't a full AST course. We have a companion rescue skills course, which is great to take as a refresher and keep your skills tip-top. If you need some evidence of how that's helpful, check out the Cherry Bowl story at avalanche.ca. It's a really good example of how that companion rescue skills course really can save lives. Another helpful course you might want to look at is managing avalanche terrain, and that's a good course to take after you've taken your AST1 to keep your travel skills super sharp, and a lot of that relates to what we've been learning tonight. All the Avalanche Canada training courses are run by folks who are vetted by Avalanche Canada, and they follow our world-leading curriculum. So make sure you check that your instructor is a licensed AST provider and part of the Avalanche Canada training program. We're so proud that we've got such a great diversity and variety in those licensed providers, so you're sure to find one that's great for you. Now, on to other important things, prizes. Amy's going to pull some names for us for some winners.
Thanks, Sarah. So tonight we have prizes from Avalanche Canada. So we have 2 goggle socks to give away, and those are going to Darcy Croman and Sonia Walbank. And then we have an Avalanche Canada hat, which is going to Fumiaki Sakai. And make sure you drop us or send us an email. I'm going to drop the email address into the chat now to claim your prizes. And I'll pass it back to you. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Amy. And well done to everyone who won a prize and stayed to make it to this point. And we really appreciate everyone being here tonight and your interest in avalanche safety. If you can afford it and you'd like to help by making a donation to AvCan, you can use a link that's in the chat box, or you can scan the QR code that's on the screen to make a donation. You can support essential programs here by donating as little as $10. The next webinar is going to be Wednesday, January 31st. It's choosing terrain for snowmobilers. And the format of that webinar is quite similar to what we did here tonight, but it's geared more towards sledders, their riding regions, and the kind of choices that you make that are different on a sled. If you do both, we really recommend it. Pre-registration for that's required. Thanks everyone for coming out and showing an interest in avalanche safety. We hope you enjoy your winter in the backcountry, safe from avalanches. Good night.